like more than a year long, right? It starts out as a one-day boycott, right?
Right.
And then everybody does it, and so then they decide to continue it. Right? And part of how they continue it is they organize these carpools, right?
Right.
And they have to raise all this money to be able to do those carpools. And so part of how they do that is a number of people like Rosa Parks, like Martin Luther King, like E.D. Nixon, start to go around the country raising money. So part of what makes the Montgomery bus boycott different is they turn what is a local thing into a national movement. So part of what makes the impact on the United States is, in fact, how much people are following what's happening in Montgomery. And that's partly because organizers are going around the country, partly because there is some media coverage, newspaper media coverage. The black press is covering it a lot. What we might call the mainstream press starts to cover it, particularly after, in February, to try to break the boycott, the city indicts all the boycott leaders, and this gets a lot of press attention. So that's when you see the first stories in the New York Times or the Washington Post. So that also starts to make it into a bigger story, and it's partly because the city is being so resistant to any change, any compromise. And so as the city is so resistant, boycott leaders both start to demand more. They file a federal court case. Obviously, it goes to the Supreme Court. So that court case also has an impact. So I think it has an impact in a number of ways, both in terms of the law, because so many people are watching the possibility of this kind of organized, unified sort of stand that can continue over months and months and then into a year, makes other people feel like they can do it too.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Where would we go for, like you mentioned, it was followed by the black press. Are there some places that we could go to find some of the primary sources and reporting on that?
Yes. One of the things that's happened recently is the major black newspapers are now digitalized, which means you can search them.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be like the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, basically then the Amsterdam News, and they all had fairly big reporting staffs, and they would report things differently. They would send reporters down. It was, in some sense, the black press was even bigger then than it is today in terms of their independent reporting. So if do you have access to a university library?
We just have like EBSCO host and things like that. We don't have probably access really to a college university library, no.
Okay, because there's a search engine called ProQuest, Historical Black Newspapers, and you can search, so you could search a black newspaper for 1955 and say, I want to see all the mentions of Rosa Parks, or I want to see all the mentions, across all these newspapers to the Montgomery bus boycott. So it makes this kind of research a lot easier. So again, a number of universities now would have it. Some public libraries would have it, particularly big ones. Like the Schomburg Center in New York would have it. Obviously not New York, but it's called ProQuest Historical Black Newspaper.
Okay, all right, that's helpful just to have the name and try to get on. And the Pittsburgh Courier, what were the other ones?
Like the Chicago Defender, the Amsterdam News. Those are sort of three of the biggest ones. I think there's maybe 6 or 7 now that are digitalized.
Okay, thanks.
My second question is, what impact did the Montgomery bus boycott have on the Cold War? Did it impact the Cold War or its leaders have an effect on the Montgomery bus boycott and the civil rights movement?
That's a great question. So one of the things that you probably know happens during the civil rights movement, because it's happening while we're in the midst of this Cold War, right, is that a lot of these leaders are going to be accused of being communists.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. And so one of the things that I talk about in my book, right, is in part because of this climate. You see, even though Rosa Parks has this whole history before we get to the boycott, this whole political history, as the boycott sort of takes off, you start to see Black leaders like Martin Luther King, you start to see Rosa Parks herself, you start to see Black reporters background that political history because they're worried about red baiting. She almost immediately in the white community in Montgomery, she's considered a potential communist, a potential traitor, a communist plant. So the Montgomery bus boycott unfolds in this sort of climate, and so they're always worried about being accused of being communists. And so, like I was telling you before, the decision to send people around the country to fundraise is a difficult one because there's a fear that then they will be also accused of, bringing in outside money and outside influence. So she will be accused of being communist. King will be accused of being communist. This will continue even after the boycott. So that's one side of the Cold War. The other side of the Cold War is the United States it's worried about how it appears to the world. And so there are moments in the Montgomery bus boycott, in the desegregation of Central High School in Little Rock, right, where that becomes news not just in the United States, but outside the United States. And that makes the United States look bad. And so there's some incentive for the United States to act a little bit better. So you might know, the Brown decision in 1954, right, that the NAACP does. The US Justice Department comes in on the side of the NAACP in that case, not because they necessarily are committed to desegregation, but they write a brief basically saying this is going to be good for our foreign policy.
Okay.
And so that's the other side of the Cold War, which is sometimes the Cold War because the world is watching the United States because the Soviet Union is using the United States racism against it, because the United States is trying to convince newly independent countries in Africa and Asia not to become communist. There are ways that civil rights at home become a key issue, and so sometimes you can get changed because the world is watching. Does that make? Yeah.
Yeah.
This is William's dad. I have a question. Domestically, was it understood what it meant to be called a communist? I mean, why was it bad, communism at that time?
Right. Well, there's part of what's weird about this fear of communists is there's a belief at the time that part of what communists are going to do is they're going to come and they're going to weaken us from within. And they're going to sow dissent, and they're going to try to disrupt our way of life. And part of how communists work is that they kind of they come in from within. And so part of why civil rights activists are being accused of being communists is because some are communists. Part of why they're being accused of being communists is because they're saying there's something wrong with the United States. And that is seen as something a communist would do, that they would be trying to disrupt us, they would be trying to sow this problem in the midst of us. And then the other thing is some people, and I would put Rosa Parks in this category, also are working alongside communists at moments in the movement. And so there's a fear that communism is like a disease and that it will just spread. And so even if you're not, so they talk about people not necessarily as just communists, but as fellow travelers. And that's the fear, or that if you're with communists or you're hanging out with communists, that they will influence you to do things, even if you're not a communist or in the CP yourself. But mostly it's just that civil rights activists are making this profound critique of the United States, and that's seen as dangerous and also kind of the kind of thing that communists are doing. And so there's a fear of that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
How did the Montgomery bus boycott impact the world? Not so much in the Cold War, but like the Bristol bus boycott and Nelson Mandela. Are there other international impacts?
So I read about in my book how much, sort of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, is they are watching what's happening in the United States, just as people in the United States are watching what's happening in South Africa. And right after Nelson Mandela is free, he comes to the United States, right, on a tour to promote kind of U.S. divestment from South Africa and apartheid. And when he gets to Detroit, there are all of these politicians and important people, and she's there, and he kind of misses all those people, and he goes directly to her, and he hugs her, and he's chanting her name. And so I do think she and the Montgomery bus boycott at King become also an international symbol of resistance, both in terms of the actual tactic, like you're saying, the use of boycotts, although it's not new in Montgomery, but the possibility that you can have a community stick together is very. So I think there's an impact both in terms of the literal idea or practice of it, but I also think just getting to see it, right, and to see it happen, and then to have then all of these movements kind of keep going after, so that it becomes sort of the beginning, right? Sort of, and in part because King is there too, right? That it then is seen as this kind of cascade, as sort of like, so in some sense it's sort of an opening act, if you know what I mean.
Okay.
Well, you can ask, you don't have to just ask the questions that you planned. If you want to ask other questions, or if you want to tell me things that you are thinking about, we can also do that.
Okay.
Okay.
How did President Eisenhower feel about civil rights?
He's not so good. So you probably know, right? One of the big things Eisenhower does is he appoints a man by the name of Earl Warren to the Supreme Court. And Earl Warren will kind of come to lead the Supreme Court, and he'll be the Chief Justice, and he's partly who's responsible for getting the unanimous decision in the Brown case, and he goes on to lead the court in a number of other very important cases around civil rights and civil liberties. And Eisenhower will call his decision to appoint Earl Warren to the bench sort of one of the worst mistake I ever made, or something like that. Because Warren is such a civil rights jurist. In Little Rock, right, Eisenhower does ultimately intervene on the side of desegregation, but only, I think many scholars would argue, many people would argue, because it becomes this issue of the federal government versus the state. So Eisenhower tended to see people like Rosa Parks, to see people like the young people who were, desegregating Central High and Little Rock as extremists. If he didn't, the need to desegregate now is not a priority for him. When we get a governor flaunting the rule of the federal government, Eisenhower then steps in, but he's not committed to, he's not committed to civil rights in a very substantial way, I guess we could say.
What would Rosa Parks think about America today?
Well, to the end of her life, right? Rosa Parks is saying the movement's not over. She's an activist, so she's, the boycotts in the 50s, right? She continues on in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. She's doing all sorts of things, right? She's doing